Hi everyone, welcome to Sheffield DocFest and welcome to this panel, Learning How to Live Together, a Symbiotic Worldview. My name's Jamie Allen and I'm the programmer of a section of the festival called the DocFest Exchange. And I will put in the chat, so this is a section of the festival which is supported by the Wellcome Trust to make a space for conversations around the climate crisis, climate justice and planetary health, or the health of the planet. So this year we're doing this through the concept of perspective and scale. So we have a program called Beyond Our Own Eyes, which asks how shifting our perspective might change our relationship to each other and to the natural world. And as part of this program, we showed John Feldman's film, Symbiotic Earth, about Lynn Margulis and her ideas. So we'll continue the discussions that we've learned about through his film in this discussion. So a few things just to mention is that this talk is live captioned. So you will see at the bottom that it's coming up with English live captions. You can switch this on and off using the little CC button at the bottom. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. So the little like speech bubble at the bottom. And now I'll hand over to Grégory Castéra, who is a curator and the leader of the Collective Practices Research course at the Royal Institute of Art, who will introduce himself and this session. So thank you very much.
So hello everyone, and thank you for joining this talk. Thank you, Jamie and Jamie Allen and the Sheffield DocFest for the invitation, for organizing this discussion on the topic of symbiosis, and for the great program that you've been developing this year. It was very exciting to see it. So as Jamie said, I'm Grégory Castéra. I'm a curator and an educator. I speak here. I'm in Paris, in a very sunny day in Paris. I run this postmaster of collective practice at the Royal Institute of Art in Stockholm, where we inquire about the transformation of the culture field with symbiosis thinking and symbiosis practices. So I will moderate this discussion today in English with a French accent, as you can hear. And we have very little time to discuss today about a very rich, complex topic. It's only 1 hour, and the topic we will try to explore. The question we try to explore is how a symbiotic understanding of life could inspire a more caring, collaborative, collective view of the world. So we will have briefly, I will say 30 to 40 minutes to discuss with our guest that I will introduce very briefly. And then the second part of this session is about questions from the audience. So please don't hesitate to add question in the chat, and we will gather them, and I will share your question in the second part of this session, this conversation. So the speaker today, so it's a great pleasure to be with Yasmin Kumordzi, Suzanne Pierre, and Salome Rodek. Maybe you can turn on your camera. Exactly. Thank you. So Yasmin Kumordzi, she's a parasitologist, PhD student at the Durham University, and co-initiator of the Art and Science project and the Symbiotic Love Calendar. Suzanne Pierre is a microbial ecologist, biochemist, and founder of the Critical Ecology Lab, which is a queer, BIPOC, immigrant-led nonprofit research lab situated in California. And finally, Salome Rodek is a cultural and literary scholar, doctoral researcher working on the term of symbiosis. So welcome and hello for the three of you. Now we go to the first round, and this first round is around, I will say, introducing your work and your interest for symbiosis, and then the second round will be maybe more speculative. We will go to more speculative question, and you have briefly, I will say, five minutes each to answer to this question, to try to stay within this 1 hour time frame. I think I will start with Salome. So Salome, could you define symbiosis first, and especially through two major figures that you've been working on, Donna Haraway and Lynn Margulis, why their work is important to understand symbiosis today?
Yeah, thank you. And also, of course, thank you for having me. Well, I guess the simple definition for symbiosis is the living together of unlike organisms, so organisms that are not members of the same species, living in a more or less continuous relationship with each other and mostly exchanging nutrients. I guess that's what's happening in most cases. And I guess I could just tell you about my project, which is I'm interested in situating, as you mentioned, Lynn Margulis and Donna Haraway, because when I was writing my master's in 2017, I noticed that the term symbiosis was popping up in the humanities a lot, and I got really interested in why that was happening and why that is happening at this particular moment in time, and what makes symbiosis such a easy, apparently, concept to travel from biology to the humanities and arts. And yes, while looking into this, I realized that it's mostly Lynn Margulis and Donna Haraway that are always are repeatedly brought up as kind of inspiration and key figures. And I mean, should I just go into why I think they are and just elaborate a bit on this? Yeah. Okay. So I think, I mean, Lynn Margulis, as maybe those of us also watched the documentary maybe know by now, that she kind of counts as like the historian Jan Sappi has called it a Charles Darwin of symbiosis. And that is not necessarily because she was the first to ever talk about the significance of symbiosis. Others have alluded to symbiosis before her. But I think it's because she just did it at the right time. And that was when DNA sequencing got really a lot more advanced, and also microscopes got even better. And so we could actually see a lot more that was going on, both on the molecular level and on the cellular level. So I guess the evidence and the technology were there for her to kind of stress her points. And I think what's also really important about Lynn Margulis, and I think that the documentary also shows this very nicely, is that she really was very good at stressing kind of the grander vision of her science, and what it could mean that they were observing. And yeah, what they were observing, or what is most important in Lynn Margulis' science is that she made this claim that symbiosis is a major factor of evolution, especially if you look at the very early evolution of life. So really looking back to like 3 billion years ago. And she was really criticizing classic Darwinism and the reductionist neo-Darwinism of her time, that ignored mostly bacteria and microorganisms, because most of these people were zoologists, so they were looking at animals and some were looking at plants. Very few were looking at bacteria. Bacteria were thought to be pathogens. They were studied in completely different sections of the university. And she really said that that Darwinism overemphasized competition and sexual reproduction as well, and also genetic mutation as the only drivers of evolution. And she was saying, well, I'm looking at bacteria all day and other tiny microorganisms, and they're doing very different things than just like reproducing like animals do. And I think that you could say the kind of playfulness of bacteria and microorganisms, like recombination, the partial eating each other but not fully digesting and so on, that kind of made her reconsider how evolution might work. And so in 1965, it was her first major article that she published on her theory, which is called either symbiogenesis or endosymbiotic theory. So I guess we will hear more from Jasmine about this. But what she said there was that eukaryotic cells, so these are, I feel a bit shy to talk about this in front of biologists, but you can correct me at any time. So eukaryotic cells, so cells with a nucleus, which are the cells that are the ones in all of multicellular life, so also human and animals, plants, cells, that they came into being because of the partial fusion of two prokaryotic cells. So these are cells without a nucleus. At the time, she thought that these were two bacteria. By now, we know it's probably bacteria and an archaea, but that's not so important. What is important is that she was saying that really symbiosis, she kind of wrote symbiosis into the core of every complex living being, because it was part of our cell structure, basically. And I guess now you can just really see a huge increase in studies on the relationships between animals and microbes, and also plants and fungi. And there's more and more debate on kind of the fundamental importance of microbes for all of life, and including humans, obviously, and the physiological development, and also very important is the resilience of ecosystems and microbes, and symbiotic relationships are really crucial for the resilience.
I thank you. Sorry to interrupt. Sorry to interrupt you, Salome. It's really fascinating, and I would have loved to listen more. But I think we will come back to the different question you are introducing now, and let's continue the round. This first round with maybe with Yasmin, and and maybe can you introduce this notion of parasitism, which is, as far as I understand, one form of symbiosis, and which to make it very simple, I would say a very general understanding of symbiosis, consider that it's a mutual benefit between the two entities, whereas it is not, and sometimes some organism can be harmed, and maybe both also can be harmed by the symbiosis situation. So can you introduce this notion of parasitism, and also the more generally your project on what is your project again? The endosymbiotic love calendar.
So hi, I'm Yasmin Kamotzi, and I am a PhD student at Durham University. And my research area is drug target validation with leishmania parasites. So my separate project outside of the lab is endosymbiotic love, and we formed a calendar. Well, we made a calendar from all of our discussions, and Grégory, you explained parasitism fabulously. So it's basically just the symbiotic relationship between species, where one organism, which is the parasite, causes harm to its host. So that could be a human, an animal, anything really, an insect. So the whole idea of endosymbiotic love was less scientific and more, a mix of art and science. So it was a collaboration between artists and scientists, and the whole idea of it was to embody 12 different microbes over the year. So that was used to make a calendar for this year. And unlike quite a lot of the scientific communication and discussions that happens about microorganisms being very human-centric, we wanted this to come but we wanted the discussions to be about microorganisms, different microorganisms, but from their points of view and from how they're living, how they're seeing the world, how they relate with each other and relate to the wider world, which includes us humans in it. So because there was quite a lot of different people in it, the discussions were very varied. We all had different things that we wanted to put in, things that were important in our lives, because we all came from completely different backgrounds. So all of these conversations and discussions were what was used to conceptualize the different images, which I think Nick can put up some of. So yeah, so that's where all these images came from, and all the different stories were really beautiful. So some of them had, you know, a little bit of discussion about sexuality and gender, and how fluid, how fluid sexuality and gender are within different microorganisms. But within symbiotic relationships, I think parasitism is very interesting, because we think of symbiotic relationships and it's very positive, it's everyone benefiting, whereas parasitism is very different. We think of it as, you know, damaging the host, you know, maybe killing the host, and the host being humans from this human-centric world that we live in. However, I think being able to explore and discuss and maybe even understand parasitism can help us live in this symbiotic world, because a lot of the behavior that happens within parasitism is similar to the behavior that happens with humans and our hosts, you know, living in the big world. Yeah, so hope you enjoy those little images.
Well, thank you very much, Yasmin, and also for sharing these images. And yes, it's true that this notion of symbiosis goes very deep, also in the very understanding of what an individual is, and and still now many scientists still consider that identity lies in the DNA, that it is like the base. And there are this beautiful text, I think it's Margulis, if I remember well, when she explains that the identity is not only the DNA, but it's also this relation with the bacteria that comes from the beginning to any human being. And so that the development of any human being is this negotiation with the bacteria. And of course it allows us to revise this idea of a war again, and being at war, but more being in this type of cooperation and collaboration, which I think in the time when we are now, in the time of pandemic, is absolutely important. So let's finish this round with Suzanne, and so thank you for being here, Suzanne, too. So I have basically two questions with you. First, do you agree with what we have been saying on symbiosis so far, or do you have something to add or to complete or to? And can you, of course, introduce the Critical Ecology Lab method of environmental research?
First, thank you so much for this. I'm so excited because I love talking about science outside of the context of science. So to be with you all and have this kind of more expansive room is really, really nice. I agree completely with first Salome's framing of kind of the scientific background of how symbiosis got recentered in the conversation of biology and especially evolution, our understanding of where we came from. And I'm always just delighted and excited by the reminder that, you know, we came from this process of one organism engulfing another, but not consuming it, then becoming one, and that it's called phagocytosis. And it's, you know, exactly as she described, or they described, you know, this wonderful way of seeing that more can come even from that consumptive relationship. And I think Yasmin has really, has really also really focused on how we can learn from those processes, how it's actually like a societal kind of template for being. And I guess my expansion on that is just that one thing that I'm reminded of is that the traditional kind of Darwinian framing of evolution really depends on this notion of kind of predator-prey, right? The evolution was really focused on this relationship between one organism dominating another. And I think that that has its place. But what our other two panelists are reminding is that at different scales of biology, you'd see that that relationship is really less and less important. So at the microbial scale, predator-prey relationships exist, but are not central to how we live and how microbes live. And the same is true at kind of the ecosystem or global scale. When we kind of zoom out from the organism itself and think about kind of nutrient cycles, water cycles, energy cycles, those cycles really dictate biology, but are dependent on reciprocity. So yeah, I don't know, I want to say lots more about that, but I also don't want to overwhelm everyone. And I guess to tie that back to my work with Critical Ecology Lab, you know, my organization is a research team that we focus on asking questions about how human processes of supremacy and domination through colonialism have shaped our ecosystems and the current climate crisis. And so when I think about how we do science differently, it's really focused on the idea that like this Darwinian framing of biology does not help us, does not support our approach to understanding the environment as we see it today. So we center a decolonial lens on ecology, and I think that that really borrows from this idea that symbiosis is at the center of biology. So I can say more about that. I don't want to kind of run our time up, but yeah, I'm happy to take more comments or questions about it.
You have time. I didn't want to stress everyone with this 1 hour session, and also yeah, I think it's very wrong to be in this to put people in this rush in the time where we are now, when I think we need to find different relation to time and to everything. So if you feel free to, and also to breathe and just be silent if you want, that that's also important. But so do you want to add a last thing before we go to the next round?
Yeah, I guess, thank you. Yes, I should breathe and take a pause maybe. Yeah, I think that one aspect of our work in the Critical Ecology Lab is to offer an alternative way to be in science. So much of the actual practice of academic science and the relationship between scientists among one another as well as the public is so predicated on the same Darwinian logic that Lynn Margulis has really brought to the front as being not the center of biology, this predator-prey or kind of competitive relationship, rather than a symbiotic or a commensal relationship, where commensalism, we don't think about organisms necessarily sharing, but rather coexisting with a neutral effect on one another, a net neutral. And so I guess I just should say that our lab is also trying to offer an alternative model of behavior and culture within science, in addition to alternative approaches to the kind of ecological and global change questions that are really dominating our conversations in society today.
Well, thank you very much for this. It's very inspiring to hear the three of you and your different perspectives that are very different and very complementary. And also, as you said, Suzanne, I also think it's very important to create this type of forum when we can hear people coming from different expertise and trying to articulate, even if sometimes the language is not always the same language, but it's also the beauty of it to look for our words to express these ideas. And so I think now we have we start to understand this notion of symbiosis, and of course it will take much longer to really have a deep understanding of it, but it sets some basis for the conversation. And so now we will have a second round that is maybe more speculative, and trying to look more how symbiosis can inspire the way we work, we think, we live together. And I would like to start again with Salome because I think yeah, I think it's better maybe to start again with Salome and you've been studying many projects that use symbiotic and biological metaphor. So I give an example. We have the last exhibition of Bruno Latour with Peter Weibel and Martin Guinard called Critical Zone, the famous exhibition by Olaf Eliasson called Symbiotic Seeing. There was also exhibition by Elizabeth Lewis in Kunsthal Zurich called Scalable Skeleton Escalator that was using the holobiont, which is one of the many notions of Lynn Margulis as I would say, a methodology. There is, of course, there was also this seminar of Permacircular Museum in ZKM, and there are like many different, I would say, metaphors, as you were saying also, Salome, in the beginning of your speech before. And we also know that biological metaphor is inspired by other fields. And Suzanne, you were talking about the predator-prey, and we know that the predator-prey story by Darwin is also inspired by Malthusianism, which is an economic and demographic ideology or theory from this time that has some connection with, I will say, some ideological also background. And we know also this metaphor war we use in immunity when we talk about the relation between cells. That is, talking about war. That is very inaccurate when we talk about how immunity works, but we still use this war metaphor, and we can move on and continue to talk about this circulation of metaphor between fields. So my question for you, Salome, is what is for you the limit of this use of metaphor, of biological metaphor in the culture field?
Thank you. Yeah, so as you were saying, I think biology and society, like every science, they have a very interesting and fruitful relationship. Metaphors are traveling back and forth. You were mentioning immunology and how this paradigm of that the body or the immune system is at war with the outside world, how that defines science. So, and now that is changing as well in the light of symbiosis, for instance. So there's really a very interesting reciprocity that I'm very interested in, that biology draws on metaphors of the zeitgeist or the society they find themselves in, and then that kind of reverses, and once it's within biology, it travels outside again, and people, for instance, from the arts or humanities, but like also like the wider public in general, they draw back on that biology that was already fed by certain metaphors that didn't come from biology itself, if that makes sense. So I think what is important to know or to think about is that we can talk about symbiosis as a form of science, and we can talk about symbiosis metaphorically, and they go hand in hand. But I think it's always very good to be very careful with on what level you talk about symbiosis, just with any other concept that you're trying to describe the world with, because there's power in that, and it shapes stories and it frames narratives. And I mean, I want to say symbiosis is really cool. the kind of science that comes out of it, the way that people now describe relationships between species is super, super fascinating. And I think it answers a lot of questions that genetic reductionism has left out. And you were mentioning individualism, for instance, as well, Grégory, and I think Margulis especially, and then also Haraway, drawing on Margulis, really emphasized kind of, I want to say, queering of categories and the blurring of boundaries that you can find in looking at the biology of symbiosis. But I also want to say, as a cultural scholar, that nature obviously doesn't have any politics and any ethics inherent to it. It's humans telling stories about nature that makes them, and that saturates them with a certain politics and ethics. And sometimes I find that in these exhibitions that you were mentioning, for instance, it's people seem sometimes to have this impression that with symbiosis science, we have found a certain proof that nature is inherently benevolent. And I think what Yasmin said about parasitism was very important, because indeed the way we talk about symbiosis can sound very fluffy and happy and everyone living together, but it doesn't, that's a choice. We can also talk about it in very different terms. And it's still true to the data, you know, it's vocabulary that we use. So, and with that, I want to end with saying that we have to be, you know, biology can be used or abused sometimes for certain political agendas, and this can be very harmful. You only have to look in history and look at racism and eugenics as horrible examples of how biological ideas were abused to justify political or social means. And you would think symbiosis is way too nice to be negative, but I think it's always really important to ask important questions. If you see people mobilizing symbiosis as a political concept or a world describing ontological concept, and ask really, like, who gets to cooperate in this, or who gets to benefit from the symbiotic relationship that people talk about. Yeah, so that's just my takeaway. My speculative part is to say there's no safe natural harbor from political exploitation, and we have to be aware of that.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting warning, and of course, when you say that, I think about social Darwinism and how Darwinism has been applied as a kind of ideological framework to think about social relation. And is it interesting, possible and interesting to think about the social symbioticism or something like this? Can we? And of course, I have the feeling that many artists are also looking at this kind of very loose translation between these worlds, but also inspiring sometimes. And maybe Suzanne, you can continue. You already started to talk about this, the way symbiosis can be a model to develop critical framework about environmental research, but maybe you can continue to elaborate and reflect on what has been said before.
Yes, I don't know if this is relevant or if it was thought about in bringing me into this conversation, but I just wrote about this in an article in Mold magazine. The article is part of a series about seeds, and really that whole issue focuses on different forms of kind of biological metaphor that can teach us about how to kind of challenge the exploitative and problematic aspects of our framing of societal relations, and how to kind of go beyond them and think about future making. So anyway, this is uncanny and I'm excited to talk about it. So I think the first piece is that social Darwinism, as Salome was talking about, is this idea that gains its credence from science. And so the way that science is politicized in this way to kind of lend power to and justify social interactions and therefore political interactions, and give kind of the weight of empiricism and the weight of objectivity to something that is really a human projection and a sort of cultural effort to create power structures and maintain power relations is interesting and is upended by our focus on things like symbiosis and commensalism. And I think, I guess going back to what critical ecology really is, it's an attempt to make note of this kind of body of cultural criticism and cultural work that has gone, above and beyond to show us that that the interplay between science and power making and power maintenance need to be interrogated by scientists themselves, not just our cultural critics and not just the people in the humanities. And so what we're trying to do is actually make meaning from that relationship, the inquiry into how many kind of investigative frameworks in science are shaped by these cultural notions that are really to the benefit of those who were in power when those notions were coming about. And historically, that has been white men with money or land or other forms of capital, and straight men at that. And so I think one thing that critical ecology really aims to do is borrow from these theories and then say, well, how, if our kind of history and culture of science is predicated on these notions that have historically maintained harm for myself as a Black woman and a queer person, and also for my communities, how is it that our entry into these spaces and our participation in knowledge making can both upend those sort of traditional and ingrown harmful scientific frameworks, and then from there, how can we actually go beyond the criticism and actually use that kind of backing to say, well, what are the questions that simply were not asked because these frameworks were so ingrained? What if we upend that and replace with an idea that if symbiosis and commensalism and other forms of interspecies interactions actually dominate beyond predator-prey relationships, what does that mean for how we might investigate other types of relationships? And so for me, I'm a biogeochemist, which means I study the relationships between energy and matter and how they recycle through the living and non-living worlds. That's really just saying biology, but at the kind of underpinning level. And so all of that has really inspired critical ecology, in that we say, well, if we know that social frameworks have been influenced and are influenced by science, how have social frameworks actually influenced the biophysical outcomes that we experience today? So not just the conversation between culture and science as a practice, but culture and the actual material world. So what we're saying is, can we think about these supremacist ideologies as global change drivers, right? Can we think about climate change and measure the ways in which these kind of global environmental disruptions are related to the very same kind of honestly white supremacist frameworks that supported ideas like social Darwinism, as you mentioned, through Malthusian economics being the sort of background of that, and how do they have a physical hand, even coming from just an ideological standpoint. And so that is our line of investigation, to better resolve those relationships using the very tools that have otherwise, oppressed and exploited us.
Thank you very much. It's a very important work, and it's also interesting to see how wide is the theory of ecology, at least I will say the mainstream theory, and that how we need to look at history that is already there but totally invisible, and also maybe to is it interesting to trace also the genealogy of this other genealogy that is not the genealogy of Malthusianism and Darwinism and all of this, but another genealogy maybe that connects symbiosis with mutualization, because it's also a concept that appears at the late 19th century, for example, the mutualization, and so how this was there, I don't know, some circulation between this notion, inspiration among people who were trying to think about a different society or look at biology differently. So this now goes to Yasmin, and following the same question and more speculative question, I wanted to ask you what are for you I would say the consequence of representing and performing a parasite? What does it make you do and or think or feel to do that?
Gosh. I think a lot of the science we do and the discussions that we have about microbes is kind of performative and assuming what they think or what they feel or what they're going through. So yeah, that's a difficult one. But I just wanted to add a little bit about what Suzanne said about, global disruption and like white supremacists and things like that. I think like in parasitology and in like, looking at neglected tropical diseases, for example, that plays a huge part in that. And I think a lot of the discussion that we've been having is great, but I think it's very, very difficult for some people to have those discussions like out in the open. And I think, having other forms of bringing these views and these discussion in has been great in terms of using art within it. And in a lot of the imagery and videos that have been produced in Endosymbiotic Love, like those views and those opinions have been brought through, but just in a different form. And I guess that's performative ways of bringing up these discussions.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. Thank you for, and sorry, sometimes my question maybe are, but thank you very much. And I think it's time now to open a bit the question to the audience, but maybe since we didn't have a lot of time to, and it's like two very quick round. Does one of you has a question to ask to the two other? Do you feel there is a question to raise that hasn't been raised and that should be raised, or just a comment? Yes, please, Suzanne.
I think it's a question that I just asked myself, and I would love to hear your feedback too. What is the goal of these investigations? And first, I want to say there doesn't necessarily need to be a goal. Like, I think there's great value in just discursive and kind of exploratory thinking about the relationship between science and science as a metaphor and the way it can shape us, and it has. And also, I know that we are also in this kind of global societal position where we are grappling with really questions of our collective fate in so many ways. And those questions are basically like causing us to really ask hard questions directly of ourselves as being reflexive as people, but then to do something. So there is a reason to have a goal, is what I'm really trying to say. And I have some thoughts, but I'm curious, like, what does it do for our future, maybe together, to be asking these questions or having these chats together?
Who wants to answer? I think, Salome, you moved a bit to your camera. You wanted to say something.
I wanted to say I would love to hear your perspective and from your project's perspective, Grégory.
Mine.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for drawing the hot potato. So I take the hot potato. What can I say? It's a speculative. I'm interested in it as a professor in the course to have a speculative framework with my student at the intersection of social and environmental justice, to try to build a ground that is at the intersection of these two different extremely important question we have today. And I think one of the thing we can do in an art school is to work on political imagination and this exploring the notion of symbiosis allows us to ground the work and to look at some extremely concrete questions, and at the same time speculate. And I think there is, and it's really like a speculation. I am absolutely not sure of what I say, but I think we can map out a lot of different practice that has been done and that works somehow directly or indirectly around these questions, from science fiction, for example. I'm thinking about many Octavia Butler book who talk directly about the question of symbiosis and parasite as model for human interaction, for example. Looking also at different experiments that are done now in nature, so-called nature, but outside of the I'm thinking about the beautiful feral atlas that has been done by Anat Singh, for example. There are a lot of examples around, and I think it will be good to have to explore it and to see if we can extract something that is not only a metaphor and say, oh, everything is symbiotic, and suddenly we will call like, oh, I have a symbiotic relation with this glass of water. This type of very clumsy consequence that sometimes happens. But do you have an answer to this question, Yasmin, or do we go to the answers of the audience? But maybe Yasmin, you have a question, an answer to this question.
I think in the most probably very basic answer, but I would say just to continuously change our behavior and reevaluate what's going on in the world as things change continuously, and we need to change with it. I think just evaluating every so often is important.
Yes, thank you. And maybe, so I will, there were a few questions on the chat, and so since we are still running after time, we can read this. I will read these different questions. So we have, so let me just look for it. There is one question by Michel Bocker. So the question is, maybe I will read the two, and you choose who wants to answer to which question. So, on an individual level, can we think about building new symbiotic relation on the basis of human consciousness? That's first question. Can you read it on the chat as well, Suzanne, Yasmin, and Salome? Okay, so I don't have to read it twice. And the second question comes from Jane Lawson. I am super interested in the mutualism in nature, especially relating to fungus, and how the prevalence of mutualism in nature can challenge the capitalist realist worldview, with a comma. However, I think the question of scale is really important here, and there is a danger of anthropomorphizing, imposing our own worldview on non-human nature. E.g., some people see mycorrhizal relationship as focusing on equality and cooperation, and some people see them as much more transactional and exploitative. Are there many examples of mutual beneficial interspecies relationship in the realm of medium size and large mammal, which is a very, this question of the economical metaphor that is still going on when we talk about mutualization is very interesting question. And there is a last question by Jamie Allen. How would you evaluate the relevance of Deleuze and Guattari reflection of rhizomatic thinking and their critique of human identity through juxtaposing it with the symbiotic interspecies practice observed in nature? So it talks of 1,000 plateaus, for the translation of the notion of symbiosis into the field of politics, of thinking about social relation. I'm really sorry for my very, very, very bad French reading of the questions, but I think you can read it yourself as well. So please pick up a question and go for it.
I'm interested in talking about this, the question about the capitalist realist worldview, and also how I think talking about mycorrhizae is everyone's favorite thing, and yet like we only understand like the surface of it, so it's very like dealer's choice as far as how we are to interpret it. So yeah, I would love to talk about that. I have some thoughts. Give me 1 second. I want to like chew a little bit more.
And it's also good to have some silence during a talk. It's very good. Salome, Yasmin, did you want to jump in?
I also stopped at the word capitalist realist worldview because Margulis talks about this a lot herself, which is maybe quite unusual for biologists to really talk about worldview and capitalism. And my first initial response was to come back to my point about metaphors, and even symbiosis does not mean that it cannot be capitalist or exploitive. I think think about there are ideas, for instance, to genetically modify the microbiome, so the community of microbes in the guts of cows, because the cows are so problematic for climate change. So even there, you know, you could think of a kind of symbiotic engineering that is already happening in, think about the prebiotic industry that is just exploding, and everyone is fine-tuning their gut bacteria now. So this is not really an answer to this question, but this just came to mind that even there with symbiosis, there's no guarantee, or there's no position between symbiosis as just a concept and the capitalism worldview. And I think it was really interesting what Suzanne said about the Critical Ecology Lab, and this goes very much back to Haraway as well, is that challenging maybe some capitalist exploitative or also white supremacist structures really means that we have to talk about these things very lucidly. Like we have to make strong claims that we want to change our metaphors and we want to do science differently. And that means that science has to become more openly political as well. And that some people might not like that, but I think that's really the important message of Margulis, of Haraway, but also of what you guys were talking about, that it's really an active process and not just something that we just take out from nature and just be like, I'm out because of this, we'd have to do it. But really, no, it's because we want to create a different world. That's why we talk about nature in different ways.
Suzanne, do you want to, or Yasmin?
Sure. I think Salome, you started us in the right direction. Just thinking about there's a trap that I always come back to in using science or biology as metaphor. I think that it's obviously a useful vehicle for critiquing and kind of making sense of things, and also can be a vehicle from that gets us away from a real. And so I guess I'm going back to this like capitalist realist worldview. Like, what does it mean to be both capitalist and realist? Like, how is that terminology used as and weaponized in a way? And I think when I think of mycorrhizae, so I study mycorrhizae, and I think about the ways that mycorrhizae are involved in a spectrum of behaviors, right? Like a spectrum of interactions that can be symbiotic in this or mutualistic in this way, but can be parasitic at times. And what really determines that sliding scale of relationship is environmental conditions. So pressures on both the tree and the fungus itself. And that is, I think, the reality that I ground myself in, where if we want to use mycorrhizae as a metaphor, I think the most realistic, based on like actual measurements that we know of, the most realistic approach is to think about what conditions do we create around people that beget certain types of relationships on that sliding scale, and how can we shift conditions. And I think this goes back to, I talk a lot about capitalism in my science, and that's because I think that, again, like science creates the conversation outside of science, and we have a responsibility there. And so if we exist in conditions where people are under pressure and groups within society are sort of resourced and under-resourced in very deliberate and systemic ways, of course, certain more parasitic relationships arise. But how can we restructure things so that so that there's an opportunity to go in the other direction on that spectrum? So just thinking about mycorrhizae alone, I think there's so much a weird level of optimism about that metaphor that isn't always useful. And I think the reality is that it's not always hugs and sharing. It's really just, it is transactional, but those transactions can be shaped by the conditions in which they're occurring. So that's it.
Maybe also maybe this notion of symbiosis also brings us to understand the role of dependence, how dependent we are to our environment, to the people we live with, to this, of course it's an extraction and it's not symbiosis itself, but it says codependence is a kind of a rule of life. Basically, it's this base that is, it's not about competition, it's about codependence. And so being able to live in the world, it's about the type of dependence you organize, and this dependence can harm you. It's not good. It's not about it's sometimes it's not a mutual benefit, as you said, but I think it shifts fundamentally many elements of many elements of the structure of society. If I think about art is organized about the myth of the individual genius, and all the infrastructure of art is about cutting everything that has been done around this singular gesture of this genius. That is goes fundamentally against this idea of dependence, of all the codependence, or all this ecosystem of practices that are around. So I think for me, one of the main learning I have from symbiosis on a non-biological level is to try to see to what extent I can look at the codependence, and also look at this relation with all the infrastructure we have around us, which is economical, in law, and all of this. I don't know if it makes sense, but this is where I am when I look at this.
Yeah, I'm just jumping in to say, yeah, it makes sense. I hear that big time. And I think I know that this conversation is about symbiosis, but I really think that like bringing it, just zooming out a little bit and thinking about dependence and codependence is actually more useful, because it refocuses on the tethers between things, not necessarily the exchange itself. And so perhaps I don't know, I feel like many of our current kind of questions about relation and exploitation in society are about really like, do we even remember that these relationships and dependencies exist? Not even to the point of like what's the nature of them, but do they exist? So I don't know, most times I think we don't think about those relations.
Well, is there a very last question, or do you want to say a last word, as since we are now almost the end of this conversation? Salome, Yasmin, Suzanne, is there like a last word you want to share? Bon, no. But so I will close the conversation and say thank you everyone for being here and for staying for this hour. And it was very interesting to see this different perspective and how we are trying to explore the limits of this notion of symbiosis, and be careful about this to what extent we can use it as a model for thinking. And I learned a lot, so I'm very happy, and I hope you also learn about each other. And thank you again, Jamie and Sheffield DocFest, for organizing it.
Yeah, thanks, Grégory. I don't have much to add, just to say, from what Suzanne said as well, this conversation going beyond science, and it's amazing to, even if it was quite a short conversation, to have had this in the frame of a documentary film festival, that we can have these conversations. And this, so the DocFest Exchange, it's part of our year-round program where we're trying to extend these conversations. So keep an eye out, and maybe we can have another longer conversation or in a different format in the future. But yeah, thank you so much, Suzanne, Yasmin, Salome, and thanks, Grégory, for bringing these questions. Have a lovely day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.